So, yes, on that, can we have a warm round of applause, please, to welcome Joshua to the stage?
So, thank you very much for being here tonight. So, unfortunately, my presentation is probably not going to be the most exciting of presentations. It's quite serious. There's a distinct lack of jokes as well, so I apologise in advance for that. But I've essentially been in the chemical industry now for coming up to 6 years. I worked previously for INEOS, which is one of the chemical manufacturing giants, and I now kind of work as a chemical trader in London. But kind of the purpose of my presentation is to put forward a balanced view. So I'm not going to be coming from a perspective of Extinction Rebellion, where I think the industry should be eradicated immediately. There's a distinct need for the industry within society. We have a huge dependence on the chemical industry going forward on plastics, even though, of course, we can change the way in which we maybe dispose of such moving forward and the way in which we produce such. Neither am I going to stand here and come from the oil tycoon perspective. I don't love money. I'm not wanting to destroy the planet. I think sustainability is an extremely important thing, and it's certainly something that we need to focus on moving forward as an industry, and the industry itself needs to take a lead in as well. So things are slightly blurry on the screen, so I hope you can see them. But starting off with the main industry concerns. So the chemical industry itself contributes 7% to greenhouse gas emissions globally. This equates to 920 million tons of CO2 per year. So, of course, the chemical industry has its part to play when it comes to pollution and when it comes to emissions, and also its contribution to climate change, and this is something that needs to be addressed. The next thing of kind of interest and something that needs to be addressed is obviously the chemical industry consumes a non-renewable resource in terms of oil and natural gas. And when it's non-renewable, it is renewable over a long period of time, but on the short-term scale, indeed, it's depleting. So as per kind of current statistics on oil, we're actually only looking at 50 years or so of kind of inventories that are left for our consumption based on current consumption statistics, and current consumption is actually not representative of what will happen over the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years. It's bound to increase across this period as well. So it's probably less than 50 years. Also, single-use plastic. So single-use plastic is, of course, a very hot topic when it comes to what we should avoid, and indeed it is something we should avoid. It has pretty devastating effects on the ecosystem. So 370 million tons of plastic is produced per year globally. 50% of this goes into single-use plastic. So single-use plastic constitutes anything that, for example, we use 1 to maybe 3, 4 times and then dispose of. It also has a very low recyclable content as well, so it's not very good for the environment. Plastic itself takes 50 years or so to degrade, so it's certainly something we need to address as well. Other things are obviously just general waste and pollution. So a good example of the waste of the chemical industry is microplastics. Microplastics, so again, when plastic degrades naturally over time, it degrades into very small plastic components, and these plastic components permeate through the soil and into waterways and end up affecting wildlife. There are initiatives in place to address this, and that's some of the stuff I'll be going into later in the presentation. And other general pollution, toxic pollution, harmful emissions, and potentially accidental emissions of the industry also need to be addressed. And so here's some pretty typical negative imagery associated with the industry. You have flaring of the industry, which takes place when something goes wrong in the process. So something goes wrong, we no longer put it through the process, we send it up to the flares, and obviously very bad for the environment, but it's also heavily regulated. We have plastics in the oceans, more negative imagery, and not very good for the chemical industry, and something that needs to be addressed. And then, of course, the damage and the subsequent damage it has on ecosystems and wildlife, which also needs to be addressed. So main kind of general impact, and this is the one thing we need to really make sure we resolve over the course of the next 30 years to meet our net zero targets for 2050, is the contribution to climate change. So climate change was kind of raised initially and brought to kind of public forefront back in 2008 when Al Gore gave his presentation, and it's only taken us 14 years, really, to finally start addressing such properly. So, I mean, obviously we're all aware of what climate change is and what the negative impacts of climate change are: hotter temperatures, kind of more adverse and extreme weather conditions, melting of ice caps, rising sea levels. And we have a 1.5 degree warming target now, as per the Paris Agreement. And if we aren't to meet this 1.5 degree target, essentially we're looking at sea levels rising beyond the point whereby Barbados will be underwater by 2100, essentially 2100. So we don't have too much time to address these issues, and it's certainly something that needs to be addressed quickly. But I'm going to start, obviously I work in industry, so I have to kind of put up the fight for the industry as well. So here is a process flow diagram. You can't really see it too well. It basically goes from crude oil into olefins, into all of the chemicals we use on an everyday basis, including butyl acrylates, polyethylene, polypropylene. And looking around the room right now, for example, we have paint on the walls. This comes from chemicals. We have plastic coatings on tables, waterproof coatings. The nylon in our clothes, it's also been treated with certain chemicals. Everyday items that we take for granted that aren't necessarily your plastic bottles and the obvious kind of targets of these environmental discussions. We are very dependent as a society on all the chemical industry. So therefore, we can't completely eradicate such. From an economic perspective also, we're also extremely dependent on the chemical industry. 3,500 billion euros per year in turnover is contributed by the chemical industry. Considering Europe and the UK, it's 570 billion euros, indeed. And so I mean, we can't kind of completely forget about the impact it has on the economy and the impact it has on our lives. And this is again emphasized by the contribution it gives to the manufacturing sector. 7.5% of all manufacturing is accounted for by the chemical industry, and the rest of the manufacturing sector within Europe is kind of underpinned by what the chemical industry delivers as well. Again, more slides kind of re-emphasize this point. Value added within Europe is also number one for the chemical industry. And then jobs kind of added is second within Europe from the chemical industry. And it also underpins jobs in all the other sectors. So 19 million jobs are supported by the chemical industry across Europe. So it's not simply something we can get rid of. We have to obviously have gradual change and improve the industry that's already there. So again, it's just kind of re-emphasizing what I've already said. So it's extremely important, but we can't, as an industry, the chemical industry, forget the impact we're having, the negative impact we're having on the environment. We're an extremely large energy consumer, we're a large greenhouse gas emitter, and also a large waste producer. So these are things that need to be addressed. And things are changing. So of course we have this 2050 target of net zero, and the ways in which we're planning on getting there are through recycling, through sustainable products, through product stewardship, technological improvements, and carbon footprinting and subsequent offsets. So taking recycling as kind of the first port of call to address, things have been going in the right direction when we look from the early 2000s to today. The plastic that ends up in landfill is reducing, and plastic that goes towards energy conversion and also into recycling is increasing. And this is a trend that's also exponentially increasing when we consider the plans going forward to meet the 2050 net zero target. So looking at 2020 statistics, almost 30 million tons of plastic was collected out of kind of 55 million tons of production within Europe. Of this 30 million tons, 10.2 million tons of it was recycled. A further 12.4 million tons of it was put into energy recovery. This is things like gasification, which then reduces it back down to its original components, so syngas, for example, or pyrolysis, which reduces it back down to synthetic crude oil, which then can be burnt and reused for energy generation. And then also 6.9 million tons of still ending up in landfill. This is a figure that needs to be improved going forward, but it is definitely a trend that's going in the right direction. On to the next point, sustainable products. So this is one I've been intimately involved in myself when I was at INEOS. So when I was there, essentially, I was responsible for introducing bio-PVC, or bio-attributed PVC, or biovin, as we call it. We essentially took bio-naphtha from a Finnish producer called UPM. Where we purchased this, it was transported to the cracker in Cologne. The cracker is one of the most important kind of unit operations in the chemical industry. It cracks the natural gas into olefins chain, which is the main feedstock component for the chemical industry thereafter. But we took this bio-naphtha, cracked it into bioethylene, and then sent this down the pipeline to form bio-PVC. And this is kind of typical of what's happening in the industry right now. Sustainable products are becoming more of a norm, and certainly something that the industry is working towards. And the kind of eventual effect of this is a greenhouse gas emission saving. So applicable to suspension PVC, as an example. Suspension PVC is stuff that goes into pipes, window profiles. There was a 92% greenhouse gas emission saving by producing it via this method versus the conventional method. And this is definitely becoming more of a norm. Emulsion PVC goes into stuff like vinyl flooring. There was a 74% greenhouse gas emission associated with that. And you're not allowed to simply claim this without there being some sort of substantiated evidence for such. You have to go through rigorous kind of compliance checks with certifying bodies, and these bodies exist throughout the industry for different products. You have RSB, ISCC, all those certifying bodies to make sure that you're doing what's needed when it comes to kind of proving your sustainability. So that leads nicely on to the next point of product stewardship. So product stewardship essentially is making sure that we as an industry are changing the ethos of each particular company to make sure that sustainability is at the core of the ethos going forward. So whether this be kind of reporting or basing your KPIs on sustainable metrics, choosing your business partners based upon how sustainable they might be or what sustainable rating they have. I just realised I'm much louder now. So it's basically changing the culture of a particular company, and this is one thing that we are actively changing as an industry, making sure that we're addressing and kind of building it up from bottom to the top to make sure that we're heading in the right direction. Because if you don't have the full buy-in from the entire company, you're not going to make it there. Apart from building it into kind of business metrics, we also have industry collaboration and also collaborative networks. So there are plenty available across all the product chains that we deal with. You have organizations like Vinyl Plus, Plastics Europe, ECVM, Alliance Against Plastic Waste, bringing industry leaders together and kind of addressing the issues that we have in industry and then putting forward the solutions and how we get there. And that's kind of where 2050 net zero has come from, and there's many other initiatives like Operation Clean Sweep, which addresses the microplastics issue that we have in industry. Here, for example, Operation Clean Sweep operates in the UK. It addresses investment in making sure we clean up waterways that are already kind of infected with the microplastics as such, and also preventing the release of microplastics into the environment from source. The next point is technological improvement. So technological improvement is quite a broad point as such. Kind of on a more generic scale, it's improving the efficiency of the industry. So as you can imagine, chemical plants that are 30, 40, 50 years old, even older in some cases, they're extremely unreliable, and as they get older, the mechanical parts fail, and as a consequence of such, greenhouse gas emissions end up typically increasing. So obviously reinvestment back into the industry helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Aside from that, we have our new process routes and product introduction, which may be the green products, as already mentioned, the bio products. You also have integration of renewable technology, so utilizing, say, wind power, solar power, tidal power, all these different things, and replacing the conventional energy generation within the industry with these renewable aspects as well. More specifically, you have electricity-powered crackers. So the cracker is as already mentioned, the most important aspect of the business I do. It cracks the natural gas into olefins, and SABIC, BASF, and Linde are really pioneering this right now. Rather than using kind of gas and oil powered furnaces, we're using electricity-powered furnaces that are powered with renewable electricity. So to give an example, BASF in Germany in Ludwigshafen, they're utilizing this technology right now. And their plan is by 2024, they'll have a 2.8 million ton of CO2 saving as a consequence of just one single cracker within Europe utilizing this technology versus the conventional methods. So things are definitely heading in the right direction there. And the one I would like to focus on is decarbonization of the industry via hydrogen. So this is the HyNet project within the northwest of England. In orange there you have the carbon dioxide storage and capture network, and you also have the hydrogen kind of production and storage network also. So the reason why it's focused on the northwest of England is because INEOS operates up there. INEOS have a chlorovinyls facility where there's a byproduct of production, which is hydrogen, and they are investing back into this production to refine hydrogen to fuel grades and utilize such for transport industry, for fuel generation, which also provides clean fuel. So hydrogen is extremely important going forward in terms of meeting our net zero targets. In terms of some of the statistics there, it will reduce carbon emissions by 10 million tons per year by 2030. It provides nearly 50% of what's necessary for the UK to meet its individual targets for net zero, and also single-handedly delivers 80% of UK's clean energy for the industry as well. The final thing to address is probably carbon footprinting and carbon credits. I hope you all find this interesting. I'm sorry for the lack of jokes, and there's very stern faces in the audience, so I'm sorry for that. But carbon footprinting is basically what it says on the tin. So it's the industry taking accountability for what their carbon footprint is, what the carbon emissions are for any one of their particular unit operations or their business as a whole. They then calculate this and publish such for public viewing, and the users as benchmarks then improve from that point. And one way in which they can improve on that, say for example they can't easily invest in their own operations to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of their particular specific operations, they can invest in, say, another initiative that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or potentially stores it or reduces emissions in another process, and that's classed as carbon offsetting, and a particular industry can purchase a carbon credit to indirectly offset their own carbon emissions. This isn't a new kind of concept, it's been going on for years, but as a consequence of kind of the Paris Agreement and kind of more attention that's been given to the topic, it's kind of grown in demand significantly, and it's definitely contributing to the net zero environment. So this is kind of showing that we've not been ignoring you and ignoring Extinction Rebellion or Greta Thunberg up until this point. Things have been heading in the right direction in the industry since kind of 1990 to now. Greenhouse gas emissions have been reducing. They've actually reduced by 54% since 1990 to 2019 or so, and they're going further in the right direction. This is primarily through fluorinated gas emissions and nitrous oxide rather than carbon dioxide, but when HyNet and similar projects across Europe get rolled out, then hopefully this will also improve the carbon dioxide emissions and get us to where we need to be. This is quite an important slide. So the chemical industry, of course, isn't stagnant in terms of its demand. So demand is growing constantly for the chemical industry and the products it produces. So whilst demand has actually grown by 47%, these are all European statistics, by the way. So global statistics are probably actually more so when you include China. So the industry has grown by 47% in terms of its production output to meet demand. But then greenhouse gas emissions in the same period have reduced by 54%. So the industry has almost decoupled itself from growth with greenhouse gas emissions, which is a great place to start. But of course, more needs to be done in order to meet the targets that have been set. These are kind of just further slides to emphasize the points I'm making. Pollutants into the atmosphere, into air, into water, into soil, they're all reducing accordingly through kind of better technologies, better efficiency, better regulation, all those sorts of things. And again, re-emphasizing such, so emissions to air has fallen by 70% since 2007, and emission into water has halved as well. But much more needs to be done. So we are to meet our targets for the Paris Agreement. You can see here, business as usual is the dotted line at the top, and then the bar charts going down are where we need to be in terms of our carbon dioxide emissions or equivalent emissions to meet the net zero targets. So much more needs to be done, and we're kind of starting as an industry via the methods I've already described, but it needs to accelerate also, and there needs to be more buy-in as an industry to get there. Other things that need to happen, I mean, this all goes towards the circular economy point. We need an enabling government policy. We need sufficient funding. But most importantly, we need also a sustainable business plan. So, I mean, without the funding present, it's not possible to actually invest all the money that's necessary to produce the change that's necessary as per the 2050 net zero plan. So I think there needs to be an appreciation also from the consumer demand perspective that either prices increase downstream, because usually these sustainable kind of routes cost more than the conventional routes. And that's why there's been a reluctance thus far in the industry to change. And unless either the products are rejected, the conventional products are rejected by the consumer, or there's an acceptance that things will cost more in the short term at least, then that's kind of a short-term barrier to change. But this isn't omitting or neglecting the responsibility that the industry has. And there was a BBC documentary, which was The War on Plastic, and they interviewed INEOS representatives up in Grangemouth, and they made an analogy for the chemical industry whereby the issues that we're facing with regards to emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, generally speaking, and the environment, was like an overflowing bathtub. And it's not simply enough to mop up the water that's overflowing to solve the issue. The issue is still present, and you need to resolve such. You need to turn off the source. And that kind of struck a chord with me, because you obviously can't turn off the source when it comes to the chemical industry. We're too dependent on such. We need it in everyday life. It's not just the plastic bottles you see, but the industry does need to take accountability and kind of lead the change. And hopefully that's something that we've started to see so far, and hopefully it's something that accelerates going forward. So, to answer the question, you may disagree with me here, so I'm sorry if I've not managed to make my point clear enough through the presentation, but is the chemical industry a friend or foe? I'd say it's definitely a friend. We need it. But it's definitely a friend that has issues. It's that friend you don't want to invite to the party, because potentially they'll embarrass you. But it is working hard to address those issues. And so hopefully from this presentation you found it interesting in terms of informing you as to what's happening in the industry. But there's a lot of work to be done, and hopefully we make it there for the betterment of the environment and also for the next generation to come. So thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. One is a personal question, as in, do you think the targets for the Paris Agreement are realistic? And second, it's really good to see that Europe is moving in the right direction. There's still lots to be done, but hopefully we'll get there. But what happens if other countries that are less regulated or less mature, like Southeastern countries, Southeast Asian countries, or China, don't hit those targets?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, obviously Europe is kind of, so to repeat for the online audience, sorry, so it's quite a long question. So, so essentially, to repeat the question, Europe is kind of leading the way in terms of the environment. So how do we account for the other nations of the world that maybe are less regulated, less compliant, and does this undermine the effort to get to net zero going forward? So, of course, Europe is leading the way. I mean, we have the most stringent regulation in Europe in terms of sustainability, in terms of protecting the environment. However, we are starting to see some significant industry change, particularly in China, where it's needed most. So to give you an example, the industry in China, the chemical industry, is controlled by carbide sourcing. I mean, the entire chemical industry is based off carbide, so coal. Because they're rich in coal in China. They're starting to really crack down on the coal industry in China for chemical production. They're regulating kind of the particle emissions that come from such, and not permitting new capacity growth that's based on carbide out there. I mean, they're forcing shutdowns out there. Recycling is also growing significantly in China and leading the way, and it has to, because China is the largest producer across the board for all the chemicals that are produced. So, I mean, it's a collaborative effort, and the Paris Agreement has been signed up to by multiple nations across the world, and much more needs to be done. But to give you kind of another statistic to answer the question, I suppose, as of last year, 500 companies, it's again a European statistic, but it's kind of representative globally, 500 companies were signed up to net zero by 2050. It's now 1,000, and it's exponentially growing moving forward. So, I mean, we have to remain optimistic, and I mean, kind of rebellious groups, say, like Extinction Rebellion, do serve the purpose because it increases awareness of everyone out there. And I think as that awareness improves, the industry will move in the same direction. Yeah.
What's bio-naphtha?
So bio-naphtha is essentially naphtha produced via or from biomass. So you're looking at the paper and pulp industry, which is what UPM utilize. They utilize paper and pulp and convert such kind of in a similar sort of process to pyrolysis and gasification back down to its original components, and bring forth kind of carbon aspects out of such to produce the naphtha, which then goes back into the ethylene, the olefin stream. So the reason why it's renewable is because it's a renewable resource, a wood, versus coal or oil, which takes millions of years to reproduce itself.
Could you explain that again, and like all of the bits of jargon?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, okay. So you have, so UPM, the company I mentioned, they utilize paper, which is from wood. Wood is wood is a renewable resource. It's very quickly regenerated when compared to other. Naphtha is essentially a component of oil and gas, which is fed into the industry and kind of broken down into its various components to produce the plastics, the chemicals that we utilize in everyday life. It would normally come from hydrocarbons, yeah.
This is an audience that doesn't necessarily know any.
I don't know, it's fine, don't worry. Neither do I, either. Actually. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I often hear that you can only recycle a plastic bottle once, but is that true? And if so, how do they know?
So, indeed, right, yeah, no, exactly. So I mean, when you recycle something, normally the amount of recyclable content in it reduces as such because the virgin plastic element reduces as it goes down. So indeed, there is kind of a limited lifespan to how much you can recycle a recycled element because the quality of such reduces as you go through the chain. It's almost like using a second-hand item over and over again and then reselling it as a second-hand item. Quality reduces as you go along its lifespan, so it's a similar thing. So I'm not really too sure in terms of the actual technical elements of such, but the quality of it does reduce as it gets recycled over and over. So yeah, that's sorry.
When you melt it down, you get some lost plastic.
Yeah.
Is there some of that you can't? Sure. What do you then get?
It's actually a separate question, right? When you talk about the recycling statistics, is it actual recycling or is it downcycling? So making a fleece jacket from recycling?
I think it encompasses the entire thing. It's not just making a bottle from a bottle, downcycling, all that sort of thing. Basically repurposing the plastic that was already there for another purpose. So. Yep.
You said you work in chemical trading, right?
Yeah.
What does that consist of?
So chemical trading, sorry, to repeat the question. So the question was, what does chemical trading consist of, or what's the job entail? So chemical trading essentially is the movement of bulk chemicals from maybe one supplier to an off-taker in another region. So my job is essentially associated with buying plastic, maybe out of Asia, out of the US, and selling such within Europe. You tend to deal on a bulk scale, so you're dealing with 5,000 tons, 2,000 tons of a particular chemical which serves a particular industry, and you're the middleman, so you're the person facilitating the deal between the two.
So do you have restrictions on what you can and can't buy, and do you have to be diligent on people you buy?
Yeah, so I mean, there is plenty of due diligence. So particularly when you're selling into Europe, there's REACH regulation, which kind of encompasses all the due diligence that's necessary. Either the supplier needs REACH, you as a trader need REACH, or the off-taker needs REACH to ensure that the material that's being brought in from another region or from a different supplier is compliant with all the aspects that is expected of that product within Europe. So it is definitely compliant from that perspective, yeah. Good.
So you mentioned the consumer pressure, and we saw one good example of this is plastic straws, right? They just disappeared, and it's now embarrassing to have one. What is the next product that we now use? Everybody uses it that you think will have the same fate. Is there one?
So, yeah, of course. Plastic straws have been eradicated from use within Europe through regulation. What is the next product that's likely to follow suit? I mean, it's difficult for me to say. Single-use plastic is definitely the target. So, I mean, single-use plastic doesn't just mean the plastic straws. It means the cups. It means the bottles. It means plastic bags at supermarkets, all that sorts of things. So, any sort of single-use plastic in that regard is definitely the first on the hit list and will be the first to go. Plastic straws, I mean, there's some outrageous statistics whereby 1 million to 5 million straws in the US are used every minute. Also, so, I mean, that similar sort of plastic usages will definitely be the first to go. So it's hard to kind of pinpoint any particular product, I'd say. Sorry for not the best answer in the world.
I have a question. Is the oil price stuff, like the fact that the economies are out to do bad things, like scientific take, is that likely to undermine efforts? Are companies likely to seek savings elsewhere, or is this something that is totally built into business models, regardless of external economic pressure?
I'd say, if anything, it's probably likely to... So sorry, to repeat the question. So oil prices right now are skyrocketing as such. Is the oil price increasing likely to undermine efforts to kind of improve sustainability and kind of the development in that respect? So I'd say, if anything, it's actually more likely to accelerate such because you're moving away from your dependency on traditional, conventional feedstocks like oil and like natural gas, which are increasing in price right now. It is definitely a challenge for the industry. I mean, we're already seeing, not to be depressing, I've already been quite depressing so far, so, but the increase in the oil price and the situation that we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine right now is definitely putting pressure on demand. And when you start to see demand destruction like we are seeing across the chemical industry, which kind of underpins all of our general consumer demand, unfortunately, it eventually leads, usually speaking, into a recession. And kind of reversing back to the question, if there is an alternative kind of feedstock or outlet for conventional fossil fuels, then fantastic. It gives us an alternative, it gives us a way out. So, yep.
A lot of the interventions and developments that you've spoken to are very Eurocentric or developing economy-centric. What do you imagine would be some of the ideal interventions, assuming that regulation is very hard to implement in developing economies? What are some of the interventions do you hope would be able to be implemented in more developing economies where access to regulation and more sophisticated technologies are not an option?
Yeah, of course. Okay, so to repeat the question, Europe is obviously a very well-regulated industry and kind of region. Those which are more in the developing stage, how are they likely to develop going forward versus, say, a developed region like Europe that has that advantage already? So I'd say those sorts of industries, you have the product stewardship aspect, where, for example, investments maybe not as readily available in those regions. They can't take advantage of technological advancements, but they are dependent, generally speaking, in those regions on imports from elsewhere. And countries like Europe, countries like the US, countries like China, where they are actually pioneering these developments, they are heavily exporting regions. So kind of indirectly, the other regions that are maybe in the development stage are actually kind of benefiting from what the rest of the industry is experiencing. As for other things, the product stewardship aspect, of course, regardless of what region you are in terms of its developmental stage, you can still kind of implement a company ethos, a kind of a bottom-up approach to improving your approach towards sustainable development. So that's what I'd say from there. I'm not an expert in this, by the way. I'm not a sustainable manager. I am a chemical trader, so hopefully I'm giving good answers here.
I feel like that was an optimistic note to end on. So
Thank you.